mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. The DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Joining me today is Jay Anglin. Jay, what's going on, man?
Oh, just loving this heat up here. Not.
Yeah, it is getting a little bit hot up there in your neck of the woods up there in northern Indiana right now, but I think it looks like it's going to be cooling off, which is why I wanted to bring you on the podcast and discuss one of the most recent migration alerts. Really, it's the first migration alert we've done of the season, coming out of the Great Lakes region, Midwest area, talking teal, Early-Goose. So, let's go ahead and kick it off with right in your backyard in Indiana. I think that's a good place to start. What are the conditions looking like, and what are you hearing from people on the ground?
The biggest takeaway really from everybody I've spoken with and my personal observations is we're still really dry, and we did get some moisture. A month ago or so, things started to look a lot better, and as Tony Vanamore alluded to in the alert, they actually got a lot of rain down there, and it kind of saved them. Up here, we got a fair amount of precipitation over the course of a few weeks, filled up some wetlands and stuff, but it didn't stay. It soaked up, which it's sort of a double-edged sword. In some ways, it's rough because there's not a lot of water, to work with as far as, especially with teal hunting, because they prefer a marshy environment as opposed to like some open lake somewhere. But on the upside, there's a lot of moist soil vegetation, and that can be said for Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, everybody really pretty much heavy moist soil vegetation flushes. So, here I have not seen many teal, but with all the vegetation, a couple of the biologists I spoke with said it's been really difficult to survey the marshes because you really can't see, unless you're there when they're actually flying and get to see them. It's really difficult to find those little pockets, those little nooks and crannies, that we can find in flooded vegetation. So I suspect there's a lot more teal here than we realize. As far as geese go, the molt migrants, we're just starting to see a handful come in, and the local hatches were great. So there's plenty of geese, but they're not feeding all that much. They're mostly still stuck on grass. There's a few birds hitting some corn silage fields, and the seed corn's coming out pretty quick in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, kind of working its way northward. And that's, of course, a big game changer. Once they start taking the seed corn out, pretty much all of the geese and a lot of the doves jump into that. So we're kind of in transition right now. And as you said, we're cooling down, and thankfully it's going to be a legit cool down. So we're looking at around here as far as the high or the upper 40s at night. North of here, dipping down into the low 40s in some cases. So I suspect with clear skies and cool temps and some favorable winds, we're going to see, pretty good push of teal, and of course some of those molt migrant geese as well come through, Indiana and some of these other states.
Yeah, I saw you had some reports from Goose Pond down there in southern Indiana too. That's a pretty good spot to bluewing hunt when they have water. What's the water situation look like down there?
So it's just like everywhere else. They probably have, more water than some places because they're able to move some water around. But it sounds like they have pockets of water in a lot of the zones. But again, it's so heavily vegetated that's going to make it really difficult to see birds. And then in a lot of the places where there's water, there's a mud flat around the water. So you've sort of got this, situation where you're going to have to hike around really do your scouting. If anybody's scouting needs to be there when they're flying. So you're talking about, dawn and dusk, kind of see where they're dropping in. And then I think I would caution people, like, for example, with me, with my knees, I'm just not going to be tromping around in shin deep mud. I'm not doing it anymore. It's probably why my knees are all blown up anyway, So, just keep that in mind. We're talking some pretty soupy stuff. And I've heard every biologist mention that. They said, there's going to be a lot of mud. And so, that's definitely down there going to be an issue. But that said, they do have, it sounds like, a fair number of birds. And that's good to hear, because that is definitely a teal hotspot. There's no question about it. It's ideal habitat. And it's, far enough south that if they get past us, they're kind of a bullseye, for a lot of birds pushing down.
Yeah, let's kind of go around from state to state here. In your kind of comprehensive alert, you did a really good job of breaking that down into states and in different areas. But one of the consistent themes that you had in there was, one, it's dry. You've already mentioned that. But two, there was a lot of mention of, you had some cooler weather last week in some of these northern regions of the Great Lakes area. And with that full moon, that's pretty much moving weather for blue wings. So I know you mentioned, especially in Michigan, we'll start out in Michigan, you kind of mentioned that a lot of hunters were reporting that they just weren't seeing the numbers.
Yeah, so this has happened pretty frequently over the past, say, 5 seasons. I've seen it here quite a bit in northern Indiana, and I hear the same thing from the guys in Michigan, especially in the southern tier of the state. We get a pretty good numbers of blue wings build up, and of course there are some local blue wings and around here in a few of the marshes. I saw some broods this year, and then we get these classic teal migration scenarios, just like what you just mentioned last week was about as good as it gets. And we lost a lot of teal, and we lost pretty much all of our doves. And so doves are kind of a good, way to track teal movement, because they're sort of lockstep in a lot of ways. It's just that doves are a heck of a lot easier to see and observe from the road and our travels and stuff. But it's not good for us necessarily looking at the opener coming. But on the other hand, guys down south should be really, really loaded up by now. I would think you would have a lot of birds that got past us and moved on. So yeah, I think this week with the cool down, and again, those cooler nights, I think it's going to recharge some of these areas. It's just a matter of, are you going to, unless you're out there, you're just not going to know they're there. And you may not even get a good survey from anybody unless they're in the air, such as the guys at Forbes over in Illinois, and they're able to get up high enough to where they can actually see some of these, areas where the birds are just tucked way back in the middle of nowhere,
Yeah, they kind of mentioned the same thing, where there's just a lot of mud flats out there on the Illinois River, especially. Kind of get into that a little bit, and what was the report that they were providing you?
Well, Josh Osborne, he's in the air with Aaron Yetter, and they're, of course, about as good as you could ever imagine anybody being when it comes to observing waterfowl. They have opportunity to do it weekly, and a lot of practice, and their techniques are well honed. So they know where to go and where to look, and where the key players are as far as wildlife areas and private, marshes. And, they're down a little bit, certainly in the Illinois, anything under 10%, as far as the long-term average isn't really that profound. And I saw we're on the Mississippi, there was a little more than that, it was up over 10%. But again, that sort of indicative of what happened last week with birds pushing out. One thing I would point out, though, is Josh had mentioned to me this morning and also in his report is the drawdowns along the Illinois River Valley, as far as, state, federal, and private, land, is parcels. They've drawn down, they've let them grow, and, assuming they get they get rain, they have plenty of vegetation for waterfowl. So that's really going to bode well for waterfowl coming through Illinois, into the Mississippi, flyway, the central part of the flyway later on this season. I think that can be said for a lot of places. There's going to be a lot of food for birds. So hopefully that goes all the way up into Minnesota, Wisconsin, and, obviously the rest of the Great Lakes region and the Midwest. But hopefully, that'll hold some birds, and we won't have this situation where these birds, come and stay for a day or two and then boogie. And then, of course, the seasons down south aren't open yet. So, actually, I think it bodes well for us looking ahead.
Yeah, looking at the regular season, that does, having that food in place for when you get water, that's always a good thing to have. Now, you talked to a couple people in Minnesota as well. I think they're fairly new to the early blue wing season. I don't know right off the top of my head how long they've been doing it, but I know it's fairly recent. Who'd you talk to out there in Minnesota, and what did they have to say?
I talked to Brett Amundsen, and I also texted a friend of mine, and he said he was seeing some as well up further north. Minnesota's a production state as well, of course, and with its proximity to the Dakotas, when you're talking the western, say northwestern third of the state, certainly there's plenty of teal, that are in Minnesota now and have been probably for a while, but they probably would see a lot of birds push through to get further south, in terms of bluewings. I'm sure they enjoy the heck out of it. I always have. I mean, we've had it in Indiana forever. And, Michigan, when they finally got their season, in Wisconsin, it took a couple of years for guys to really get revved up. But one thing I've learned about teal is you can go out and see zero teal and say, oh, I'm not going to go tomorrow. But really the fact of the matter is there's so many teal and so many migrate at the same kind of time, basically in the same sort of, 2-3 week window. You can go out pretty much any day in a good area where you have good habitat and you're in, within a decent proximity to some migration corridors and see migrating teal and have a really good shot at getting a few to come in. So I'm sure they're getting pretty good at it. You know how Minnesota is. Those guys are waterfowlers.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're probably not wasting any time there. One consistent theme across the board in your report was, it sounds like, Canada goose numbers are pretty strong. Those early seasons will be kicking off as well. Some probably already have. What are you hearing from the guys who are out there goose hunting?
We opened Saturday in Indiana. Michigan opened Friday. I was going to go Friday. The birds were, there were guys that really got into them. Don't get me wrong. I mean, if you were on a good X near a good roost, you did well. With this heat that we've had, and as well fed as they are, a lot of them are just kind of loafing. They go to a golf course or find a pasture somewhere and just belly up for the day and pick grass. So I suspect with this cool down this week, that'll really start to shape up for a lot of guys. I do know for a fact, though, that quite a few molt migrants are starting to really get down and through Ontario and push down into these states that, when the molt migrants leave in, May, June, all of a sudden you just don't see as many geese. And then the next thing that happens is sometime in September, all of a sudden you get up one morning, there's geese everywhere. And I feel like that's going to happen here any day, especially where I am in northern Indiana. We're definitely due. But yeah, no, there's plenty of birds as always. And, it's not getting any easier to find ground to hunt, but if you do your homework and scout and get out there and bang on doors, you're bound to find some success. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and I think that's the exciting thing about the early resident goose seasons and the early teal is it's really the opportunity to kind of knock the dust off of everything, all your gear, get that first shot at waterfowl. Like you said, sometimes they can be pretty hot. These hunts can be miserable. I remember when I lived up in Indiana, I did the early goose season several times, and it was just almost unbearably hot to be out there. In a world where you're so accustomed to being cold. You're out there hot. It's like, this is weird, but good times all around. Opportunities do exist. Did you get any information out of Ohio?
Basically it was what I gleaned from Southeast Michigan, and that a lot of the birds moved through. They did have decent number of birds. I'm sure there's plenty of birds along the coast of Lake Erie. I mean, the western basin of Lake Erie is so much waterfowl habitat. Some of it's moist soil, some of it's flooded, cropland sometimes, but you'll have, plenty of marsh. And so there are definitely some birds lurking around Ohio. But as far as like success, I did not get any good reports from my usual contacts. How's that? I'll put it that way.
That's good. Hey, before we get you out of here, we're going to wrap this up just as a quick little hunting habitat update. But before we get you out of here, how's the fishing up there?
Oh, it's real good. I mean, but the same things that apply to waterfowl apply to fishing. So, I'm kind of in transition from the warm water into the cold water species. So I go from smallmouth bass and muskie and stuff like that into salmon and steelhead. And, last week I was all fired up that it was going to be this week. And then all of a sudden we got into the 90s and the 100-degree weather. And so, changing gears. But yeah, fishing's been, no matter what I go for, it seems like I always do pretty well. So, the water conditions are low, clear water, and I actually like it. It makes it a little more difficult, but it sure is a lot prettier to look at than, dirty water, that's for sure.
Well, Jay, you did a great job with the alert. Great job providing an update for the Great Lakes region. And we're going to go ahead and get you out of here, but we're going to stay in touch because I know you've got some more alerts coming out, especially some in the middle of this month. Again, we'll get you back on and kind of talk through it. I appreciate you coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. Always love being here.
I'd like to thank my guest, Jay Anglin, who provides migration alerts for ducks.org. If you guys are looking for those, go to ducks.org/migration. You will find them. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listeners, for joining us on the DU podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to the DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit ducks.org/DU Podcast. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.